Snow fell in a hush that tasted of salt this far east, flecks dissolving as they kissed the cheeks of men who had not seen a warm day in a season. Maidenpool's harbor lay ahead like a cupped hand ringed by frost-darkened keys, its beacons masked, its fishermen's shouts muted to an anxious murmur. Jon felt the familiar narrowing that came when a plan reached the thin bridge between intention and consequence. He had written letters into distance, threads he could not hold. Now he would walk the rope and feel whether those threads held taut or snapped under lion claws. The convoy rolled beneath a sky the color of pewter beaten thin. Wheels creaked in protest, their rims wrapped in rawhide to muffle noise. Wagons heavy with grain rattled toward the appointed warehouse near the salt market, a slate-roofed pile with gulls clinging to the ridge like white knots. Men-at-arms disguised as drovers hunched in oiled cloaks. Ghost padded at Jon's stirrup under the whiteness of falling day, his breath wreathing the air. The direwolf's presence had quailed more than one would-be footpad on the road from the neck, and Jon welcomed that simple, primitive calculus now. Honest fear kept knives sheathed better than oaths spoken through grins. They entered by a narrow gate left ajar. The interior smelled of old fish, damp wood, and spilled grain. Light slanted in through high windows coated with salt. Crannogmen slipped into shadowed corners and vanished into the walls as if they had carried the marsh inside their cloaks. Jon dismounted near a heap of coiled rope and stood still, letting his eyes map the warehouse. Stacked barrels in rows resembling mute soldiers, a rafter where a rope and pulley drooped in dangling silhouette, a side door with its hinges freshly oiled. He knew the look of hinges tended for use. He said to Ser Jorah, "Keep 8 at the rear doors, for at this side. If they come polite, we answer with politeness. If they come otherwise, let the floorboards speak." The floorboards with thorned planks lay hidden beneath wagon tarps, their steel spikes angled to shred boots in a staggered field. A man fleeing, eyes up, would run himself lame without seeing the trap. Jon had learned as much from crannogmen who hunted men the way other folk hunted boar. By noon, the snow changed to a fine rain. It glazed the harbor stones and turned the sky to mirror. Jon waited. He hated waiting. It made a man converse with his own fear in a room without windows. Ghost sat with his head low and ears half back, not unhappy but alert in a way that made Jon's shoulders itch. He thought of Margaery in the reach among perfumed halls, her words threading through her father's pride and her grandmother's thorns to stitch something like a truce where otherwise only lances stood. He thought of Sansa and Arya in King's Landing, or one of them or neither, and set his jaw. A door groaned. Into the warehouse stepped Peter Baelish in a cloak the green of coin grown old in a purse, its hem darkened by rain. He smiled as if he had found old friends among sacks of wheat. "A bleak day to talk of summer bread," he said, voice smooth. "Have we any wine? No? Ah well." His eyes flitted quick as a finch. They noted Ghost and did not stop there, but they betrayed a tiny tightening at the corners. Fear and calculation walked together in Baelish as lovers. Behind him, 2 cloaked figures entered and shook off wet from their hoods. The first was Ser Adam Marbrand, the second a shorter man swathed in sable against the wet. He lowered his hood and lifted his chin under it, his face at once dangerous and weary. "Lord Stark," Tyrion Lannister said, "I bring you the Queen's terms, such as they are today. Tomorrow, as you know, is a fickle thing in King's Landing." Jon did not offer his hand. "And do you bring me my sisters?" Half truth, half shadow. Tyrion glanced at Baelish. "We have one girl, not 2. The other has slipped our grasp. Whether she slipped alive or bled out in some alley, the gods will not tell us yet. That was an old Lannister trick. Deliver the wound and the salve together." But Tyrion's eyes looked too honest when he spoke of not knowing. Jon's anger had no single neck to throttle. Baelish cleared his throat into a gloved fist, making a shape of deference. "If we are agreed on exchange, the girl comes with the cart of grain to the gatehouse. Swifter for all," he said, as though swiftness were a kindness and not a blade. "No," Jon said. "Here, now." He raised his voice just enough to travel up to the rafters. "Let the snow melt at our feet on this stone. Let us see if anything grows. Baelish's smile sharpened by a hair. Tyrion rolled the stick between his hands. Here then, he gestured. The third figure at the threshold moved forward, small and slow. A hood hid the face. A guard at her back carried a bundle wrapped in old linen. The girl's hands were bound in front with rope, but someone had loosened it so much a child could have slipped free. Jon had cut rope from wrists once that had cut deeper than this. He recognized the difference between foresight and cruelty. The girl passed through the light. Then the hood fell back with an impatient twitch of head, and there was Sansa. Pale, thinner, eyes too wide, bruises yellowing beneath powder. Her hair was braided too carefully for travel, as though someone had shaped her to a song and forgot she had to walk to it. She said, "Jon." And he forgot that there were men in this room who would kill him if he stepped wrong. He closed the paces between them and set his hands on her shoulders. She was warmer than he feared. Her breath caught and then ran again, like a child's first step after fever. "I will not ask if you were mistreated," he said, because he could see it written upon her skin and needed no twain of words. "I will ask if you can walk." She nodded once. "Good. Then you will walk out of here." Tyrion cleared his throat. "To avoid your sister walking out and walking into a soldier's spear, we require the paper and the grain." "The paper," Jon said, and gestured to Maester Luwin, who had traveled with them and now stepped from behind a stack of jute-wrapped bales. Luwin carried a case sealed in iron. He unlocked it and drew out parchments with formal language and old wax newly impressed. Guarantees of safe passage on northern roads for crown merchants carrying no arms. A pledge of grain shipments to the crownlands to ease the poor's hunger while the realm sorted crowns. Promises that northern men-at-arms would not bear swords east of the Green Fork unless attacked. That the Reach would not embargo the crownlands if the exchange occurred in good faith today. "Sign," Jon said, and set a quill and inkhorn on a crate. Baelish took the quill with fingers that did not shake. "My hand is not the king's, Lord Stark. It is the hand that now holds my sister's rope," Jon said. "Right." Baelish signed his name with a flourish, then added a lopsided stag as witness in a gesture so childish it looped back to insulting. Tyrion took the quill and wrote his name without flourish. When he finished, he looked up. "Your father once saved my life on the road," he said, almost conversational. "I hope someday to repay such debts. This is not that day, but it sits nearer than most." Jon inclined his head. "Then here is what sits nearer." He motioned. Men shifted tarpaulins from the nearest wagons. Beneath lay grain in sacks marked with the rose and wolf sigil dyed faint to pass in any light as simple miller's decoration. Beneath those, false bottoms. Jon's men levered them aside to reveal bushels of rye stacked in bins, packed so cunningly that to an untrained eye the whole looked no trick. "The first 20 wagons roll to the gatehouse when my sister is in the street," Jon said. "At the slightest treachery, the remainder burn. Winter rules us all." Baelish smiled too sweetly. "A pity to waste bread on fire." "Some bread," Jon said, "must first pass through flame to feed the living." Tyrion's mouth twitched. He turned to Sansa and bowed. "Forgive the chains of courtesy," he said. "They are lighter than others." He gestured to her guard, who cut the rope. Sansa stepped away like a fawn that had been speared and heeled crooked but refused to limp. Jon did not touch her yet. She would come to his hand when she had found her balance. He looked over her shoulder for Arya and found air. Perhaps that was a mercy. Arya would have scorned the choreography of this exchange and set it ablaze with some knife she stole. Or perhaps it was a cruelty beyond counting. He held hope and fear in his mouth like a coin and did not flip it. Outside, the weather, unable to decide whether to weep or hiss, sent a slant of icy rain against the quay. The first wagon, flanked by men in cloaks without colors, creaked into motion. Sansa went toward it, and then she stopped and turned. "The Queen said I would know another home like a song I left off," she said, voice small and calm. "I learned the words. I sang them, and then I forgot them. Will you teach me again?" Jon swallowed and said, "We will learn new words." And that was not poetry, but a plank you could carry a wounded man across. Baelish, watching everything, barely shifted his stance before saying, too lightly. "Then we are done." "We are never done," Jon said. "But we part." They parted. The men with red cloaks did not attack. The archers on the roof rafters did not loose. Perhaps it could have become knives. Jon knew how little it took. But Tyrion made a small motion with 2 fingers that looked to a layman like he was counting a thought, and nothing spilled. The wagons rolled. Sansa climbed into one with Maester Luwin and a guard. Jon and Ghost moved beside, low and slow. When they reached the lane, a knot of townsfolk stood beneath dripping eaves, watching with enlarged eyes. Someone threw a flower and missed. It landed in the mud. Sansa watched it sink. She did not cry. She did not cry when the first cheer went up, timid and then louder, as news darted like a small silver fish through the lanes. A girl with auburn hair, a Stark, had walked out of a lion's shadow. They made for the northern road. Jon did not look back. If he saw Baelish's face at that moment, he might decide to harvest a thorn he could not plant anywhere later. There would be time for that work or none. At the town's edge, a boy ran here and there until he found courage to stand in front of the wagon and shout, "For the wolf!" and then sprint away, his own courage startling him so that he tumbled into a heap of nets and laughed at himself. Sansa smiled despite everything. That smile did more for the men's hearts than any barrel of wine could have. They cleared Maidenpool by dusk. The road north lay as a gray ribbon through wet fields. Hedgerows held tattered flags of last year's leaves. Jon called halt beneath a copse of blackthorn where branches knit a canopy that kept most of the rain off. Small fires were kindled and banked. Sansa sat wrapped in a cloak near a fire that smelled of bay leaf and damp wool. Ghost lay nearby with his head toward the road. Jon knelt by Sansa only when the first heat rose into her face. "Do you want broth?" he asked. She shook her head. "Words," she said. "I want to use them and make them mine." He sat. For a long while neither spoke, and the crackle of the fire and the soft bray of a mule settling filled the space like balm. Sansa took a breath. "The Queen." She did not honor Cersei with title or name after it. "Told me I might wed the man she chose if I were good and silent. I did not marry him. I married silence. It was an ugly husband." She stared into flame as if reading behind fire. "I am not good at ugly husbands, Jon. You are homeward," he said. "And we will let the air teach you to laugh at silence when it comes wrapped in gold." "Home," she said, tasting it, as if it were a fruit she had eaten once and then not again. "Is our father well?" "He lives," Jon said. "He grows more like himself each day and less like his cell." He told her of Ned's journey north, the crannogmen leading, the way reed beds had breathed back the old debts of friendship. He spoke of Robb and the banners on the green fork and of Bran sitting a saddle frame with determination that turned watching into prayer. He did not say Arya's name. Sansa saved him the omission. She asked for her, voice a trembling held flat. Jon told her truth without ornament. They did not have Arya. Sansa's mouth compressed as if around a split lip. "She would not do well at court," she said, and Jon heard a terrible paradox of relief and terror. "She is a river more than a girl." She lifted her chin. "We will find her." "We will," Jon said, "because vows between siblings can be made even when gods may laugh at them." They slept in shifts. Jon dreamed of a narrow street where rain slicked stones and a small figure darted like a fish in tide, always ahead of his reach. He woke with his hand outstretched into cold air. The night had thinned toward morning. The rain had become a fine frost that etched each blackthorn twig with traceries silver white. He rose, his bones complaining softly, and walked to the road's verge. There, he ran into Ser Garland returning like a ghost from shadows. Garland nodded toward the sleeping camp. "You move men like a gardener moving water," he said, quiet admiration in it. "And now you'll have to move all this water uphill." "Winterfell sits above all the roads I know," Jon said. He glanced at Sansa. Her face, sleeping, looked a day younger. "I will bear the weight." They traveled hard. Twice scouts signaled riders behind. Twice traps sprang and made delay sufficient to slough pursuit. At the neck, Howland Reed reappeared as if conjured, guiding them across slick causeways like a spider ushering flies it did not plan to eat. Sansa rode on a small garron in the center of the snake of men and carts, wearing a man's old cloak that bore faint grease stains from years of use. When she laughed, it startled men into glancing at windows they'd shut inside themselves. They cracked them back open. Winterfell rose on a day so clear it seemed the sky had scoured itself to bone. The towers cut the blue like blunt knives. Smoke rose from the great hall in plumes that smelled like onion and fat and wood smoke. Smell so old Jon felt his chest loosen. On the gatehouse, banners hung still in the windless noon. The dire wolf on field of snow, and beside it, the twined badge Ghost and Margaery had ordered. Wolf in a curl of rose vines. When the gate opened and the drawbridge thudded down, Sansa inhaled as if preparing to sing, and then did not sing but made a sound that was close kin to it. She did not wait for servants or ceremony. She slid from the garron and began to walk with a small, fierce dignity no pageantry could match. Ned awaited in the yard with his cane. He did not stride to her. He stood and let her cover the distance because fathers learn when to let children claim their own returns. Sansa reached him and there was no eloquence. She folded against his chest and he set his hand on the back of her head and his eyes shone like ice with sun behind it. He whispered into her hair, words no one else heard. Catelyn came not running but with a measured speed that bespoke held tempest, her face naked of artifice. She put her hand atop Ned's on their daughter's head, and for a beat of time Jon thought all the wars in the world could not undo this touch. Ghost prowled at the periphery, pacing between faces to memorize new old scents. He sniffed at Sansa's hem, then pressed his forehead against her hip. Sansa's hand hovered, then settled on his head, fingers burrowing into white fur. "Hello, Ghost," she said, voice breaking at the edges, and the direwolf's eyes softened, if such can be said of a predator's gaze. Every reunion births a grief, the absent shape against which the present relief presses. At supper that night Ned said a prayer for those missing from the table in a voice that did not wobble. Sansa's gaze went unfocused when Arya's name passed his lips, and Rickon scowled at his trencher as if he could wrest miracles from bread. Bran asked Sansa to tell him of the Red Keep's maze of halls, what it smelled like, whether the floors shone like the stories said, then stopped, catching himself as if pulling hand away from flame. Sansa answered anyway, describing rooms with an odd, careful measure, her voice making the dangerous place less seductive and more like a memory that could be stored somewhere safe without rotting everything beside it. After the meal, when the hall had thinned, Ned sought Jon. They stood before a hearth now burned low. "You brought my child home," Ned said, each word hammered. Jon looked down, unsure how to wear gratitude from the man whose approval he had once craved like bread. "I did not bring them both," he answered. Ned's hand settled on his shoulder, heavy with truth. "You brought the one you could. The other remains beyond your hand yet, not beyond your mind." He paused. "And you brought her not by sword alone. That matters." Jon thought of Baelish's smile and Tyrion's eyes and all the ways men barter souls like coin. "I am glad to strike with ink when ink will cut," he said. Ned's mouth twitched, half a smile that was also worry. "Swords will be required again," he said. "But remember ink. When winter pins the realm in place, words may travel where boots cannot." They fell then into talk of what lay immediate upon them. The exchange had bought the realm a week, perhaps two. Baelish's letters hinted at some new scheme to secure Reach favor. The crown's debts grew ragged and loud. Robb had sent word of a northern victory near Oldstones, but his supply trains stretched thin as thread drawn from rotten flax. White Harbor's first grain flotilla had arrived. Manderley boasted, "Wolves might eat next month." But wolves did not fatten on next month's fat. They ate today. At Highgarden, meanwhile, the season wore a different mask. The mander glittered steel blue. Kitchens burst with late pears and honeyed figs from the arbor. Yet beneath the abundance lay the buzz of a hive stung awake. Mace Tyrell took audiences in a hall with floral carvings, his words as full as after-feast bellies and half as nourishing. Margaery sat to one side, beautiful as any painter's prayer and twice as alive, and listened until listening changed the music of the hall. She did not argue with her father's vanity head-on. She brought ledgers. She laid them out like battle maps, but maps that measured not fields for cavalry but coin for bread. "Here," she would say, pointing to a column, "is what we promised to Storm's End during Renly's rise. Here is what was shipped. Here is what the grain fetched when the wagons were turned back at Bitterbridge after his death." She did not let the grief in that name harden her voice. She would take that grief to the chapel after, and kneel where wind moved candles, and let it bleed there. "Here is what the crown owes. Look how the numbers change when we supply the north and they in turn give us timber for ship repair and iron for plowshares. Look at the stores that swell in Old Town because we took a route lions cannot claw." She did not say that midwinter would make the north the only half of the realm where grain moved at all. She did not need to. Lady Olenna said it with barbs and left men smarting into sense. The Queen of Thorns wielded gossip like a pruning blade, and she knew exactly which branches to cut. In the Privy Council, the old woman snapped, "The Lannisters are poor in everything but pride. It is the one crop they overwater. They paid for wildfire with promises and wine. They paid us with smiles like painted saints. I tire of color. I prefer green." When Hightower envoys came to dine, Olenna seated them beside Margaery and set the conversation to drift toward spearmint and draft horses and reliable winters. "The north appears cold because only fools stare at the surface," she said brightly. "Look beneath. A cellared steadiness. I fancy the feel of it under our feet." Hightower men nodded without realizing they had made any decision at all. Margaery wrote at night by a window where vines hissed in night wind. She wrote to Jon words that avoided grand declarations and found their grit in detail. How many carts the Reach could spare, which villages along the Rose Road would welcome northern couriers, which house harbored sympathies for wolves, which responded only to coin. She included small shapes when she drew a map, a mill here with an undershot wheel that ran even in low water, a stand of chestnuts ripe for harvest that could last men a winter with salt. She threaded encouragement between numbers. "You were right to meet in the open. Cruelty grows in dark." She cut herself once upon the quill's nib and pressed that little half-moon of red into the page where the ink had faded, letting her husband carry a drop of her literal life along with the lines. Loras came in secret one dawn, his eyes ringed dark, his jaw-line like a hardened edge. He smelled of horse sweat and old fear. He entered his sister's chamber like a ghost who did not believe he would be allowed to knock. He tried to speak of Renly and could not. He threw himself at the floor and pressed his forehead to the soft pile, and his shoulders shook without any sound. Margaery knelt and set her hand upon the back of his neck, feeling the cords strain beneath skin. When at last he could breathe again fully, he sat back and looked at her with a boy's eyes temporarily returned to a man's face. "You have married a winter," he said, not unkindly. "Strange. I thought once I would be the one to lift you beyond fog." "I married a season that knows bread," she said. She brushed hair from his damp brow with a tender gesture that would have embarrassed him as a child and steadied him now. "And a man who knows silence is not a virtue." She told him, in measured strokes, what the Reach did not know yet of Ned's return, of Sansa's rescue, of the corridor of grain. She told him the one name she did not say aloud in hall, Arya. She saw the blade-quick love for her in her brother's eyes flicker at the edges of that name, and she forgave in advance whatever rashness it might lead him toward. "Joffrey is a boy who wears a crown the way a child wears a helm. Too heavy, too low?" Loras said through teeth clenched not to betray other things. "But men around him hold the strap." "Then we will cut straps," she said. Loras kissed her knuckles and vanished into day, carrying a new map inside him. Back in the north, letters traveled inside birds' bellies and men's cloaks. Word of the Maidenpool exchange reached Robb at Seaguard. He led his riders in cheers. Then he grimly ordered scouts to find any whiff of Tyrion's movement. The imp did not stay in one place. He was a piece that could cross the board diagonally and then vanish beneath it. Jon received a short note from him days later, written in hand that teetered between mockery and respect. "I find myself admiring gardeners more than swordsmen. Do not mistake that for affection. But where I can, I will prune monsters. Tyrion. Jon read it twice by firelight and set it in the case with Margaery's pressed flower. The Crown's reply to the grain for hostage pact came at last, borne on cream paper reeking faintly of Tyroshi perfume. Baelish's hand, though the seal carried the lion and stag twined again. It was half acceptance, half challenge. Deliver the promised grain to Duskendale, not King's Landing, and the Queen would send a barge with Sansa to exchange at sea under a flag of neutrality. Sansa had already been exchanged, which made the stratagem either proof of Baelish's gambits nodding upon themselves or another thread in his wider design. Ned grunted when he read it, a sound of a man stepping on a thorn he half expected and still resented. We cannot chase every stage trick he conjures, Ned said. We will feed who needs feeding within reach of our hand. We will build while they juggle torches. War is a juggle, Jon said, and a hearth. We must keep both. He sent answer polite enough to read as compliance with the parts that demanded decency and hard enough to crack one tooth of the parts that sought leverage. White Harbor would supply Duskendale's poor from stores already in the bite, escorted by Manderley galleys. No northern hostage would be provided again for the same coin. He sent the letter with a man whose son had died of a southern fever. Such men did not drop messages in the street to chase apples. As work pulled him outward, Winterfell held him inward. Sansa began to find her voice again, not in songs but in small orders she issued and obeyed. Set broth to simmer. Mend this seam. Send a loaf to the mother with the baby who coughs. She walked the gods' wood with Arya's memory like a second sister beside her. Once she stopped before the heart tree and pressed both palms to its bark. Give her back, she said quietly, not bargaining, not commanding, just stating need in a voice that reached Jon's bones like cold. He stood listening a while at the edge of the clearing, then left her to that red, bleeding face. Old gods do not bargain. They absorb prayers like the ground absorbs blood and carry them somewhere beneath names. Winter roared in early. It came down from the Bay of Seals in a hard white that erased ruts on roads overnight, that taught men the humility of planning and the arrogance of hope. White Harbor's last barges skittered into the river mouth under sails stiff as parchment. Manderley's men sang louder than sense to keep their courage warm. In the forges hammers fell until arms ached, a music of survival. In the glass gardens, where warm air fogged panes that never seemed fully clean of years, the winter apples blushed late and sweet. Margaery had sent cuttings from a reach varietal that took to hot iron and glass like a migrant to a new language. Children brought pails of snow inside and watched it melt into cisterns, the simple science of need becoming a game. On a night when stars cut through the cold to press like pins against eyelids, Jon walked the ramparts. Ghost trotted a yard ahead, stopping now and then to test the wind as if reading a letter only wolves saw. The world was so quiet his breath sounded like the softest part of a song. He thought of Margaery walking somewhere under a different sky. He thought of the path between them like a white road, unbroken only because both kept stepping. Then horns sounded from the south tower. They were not alarm horns, not the long-calling grief of a breach or a raid. They were bright and urgent in a way that meant arriving company under banners of friend. Jon's stomach lurched. He ran for the yard as if he could outrun news. The outer gate opened. Snow whirled in. In came a column of riders trimmed in green and gold, their pennons stiff with frost, their horses blowing clouds. At their head rode Ser Garland, cloak rimed with ice, and beside him, wrapped against the cold, Margaery. She looked thinner. Her cheeks were wind-chapped. A small cut marked her lower lip where a tooth had gone through when a horse stumbled on black ice on some nameless road. She swung down from the saddle before anyone could run to help her. Jon reached her without remembering moving. They did not kiss as storybooks prescribe where servants can see. They pressed their foreheads together for a second that stretched and then snapped back to time. Then Jon stepped back and bowed to her in the yard, formally, because both had fought long for the right to perform such ceremony and feel its heat. She curtsied low to him with a little trouble because her thighs were cramped from days astride. Her breath made a halo. Then she straightened and smiled, that small sideways smile that had first anchored him on a parapet months past. "I brought you thorns," she said, "and bread." Bread arrived in carts behind, accompanied by letters with Hightower seals, by a delegation of Old Town merchants who had decided in candlelit rooms that investing in northern winter would pay better than chasing Lannister warmth. Thorns arrived in words and in coin withheld from King's Landing trades, in hints to the faith that Cersei's attachment to her twin had the smell of rotten fruit, in a new rumor weaved with care that Stannis' Red Woman had burned King's blood. In war, bread and thorns together could build hedges impossible to ride through without bleeding. That night the hall filled with a noise Winterfell had not held since the wedding feast. Laughter broken by sober talk, cups raised, boots thawing, new plans sealed with fingers pressed to tables. Margaery, though tired, ate like a woman who remembered she owned a body. And then she slipped away to the warm quiet of the library tower where Jon found her asleep among ledgers with a quill in her hand. He eased the quill away, wrapped a cloak around her shoulders, and stood for a long time watching her breathe in a cadence that matched something inside him he had once thought belonged to the wall. Morning found them before the map again. The Lannister offer had moved like a crab along a beach, sideways and cunning, and would pinch again. Baelish's letters grew more elaborate, more perfumed with plausible deniability. Tyrion's grew rarer and sharper. Stannis had not vanished. The Ironborn slunk along coasts like winter foxes. The Vale teetered. Lisa Arryn's reclusiveness hardened into a shell that no letter could crack. In the Riverlands, Fry banners pivoted with the wind. Roose Bolton's eyes gleamed in candlelight where he sat too still and agreed with the last person to speak. Ned watched the names and lines and said, "We must prepare for betrayal not with outrage but with work. We build a world in which betrayal carries no harvest." They built. Roads tamped hard beneath early frost so carts would not founder. Hostels set at measured distances along military routes to keep men out of small folks' barns. Mills whose wheels turned even when the river crawled with ice. Rules posted in Wintertown on how much would any one family might gather and which groves to leave until thaw. Margaery sat with old women and learned how northern hands plaited straw so it shed snow. She had the pattern copied and sent south to villages who thought they could teach the north about thatch. Jon sat with young men who liked the weight of swords too well and taught them how a shivering child with a cold in her lungs could undo every victory if the grain store failed. One evening they walked the yard at dusk, lanterns bobbing like a slow constellation along walls. Sansa, muffled to the eyes, moved ahead with Bran, describing a new embroidery pattern she had devised that wove a rose's thorn into a direwolf's shadow along the hem in a way only the wearer would know. Rickon tumbled past them in a tangle with Shaggy Dog like a man wrestling his future into obedience. Jon and Margaery fell behind without meaning to. "Do you hate me for leaving to go south?" she asked, not dramatic, simply seeking a true answer she could hold against storms. "No," he said. "I hate only the miles that asked it of you. And even then, I cannot hate a road that brought you back with bread." He reached for her hand. "I will carry your absence better next time. The first time taught me the weight." "There will be a next time," she said, and did not cushion it. "We have chosen a life with many next times." He nodded. "Then we will make each one a bridge and not a crack." Snow fell, slow and fat, the kind that lingered on lashes and made everyone look briefly younger. She leaned into his shoulder while they walked the length of the Godswood Wall. Somewhere beyond it, the heart tree regarded them with the implacability of winter. Margaery had come to like that implacability. It reminded her of stone walls in the south that never pretended to be softer than they were. Horn calls brought the night's quiet down with them. A rider, white with frost, arrived from the east with a letter sealed in red that was not the Lannisters' red. This was the dyed cloth of the Night's Watch. Jon broke it with a care that made Margaery look up sharply. The words were few. They would have turned a summer hall cold if men there had any sense left. Whites beyond the wall in numbers, villages empty, black brothers missing. A name he had not seen since childhood nurse tales scrawled in a hand that had not meant to write it. Others. Jon felt, for a breath, as if he had swallowed winter whole and it had frozen inside his lungs. He looked at Ned. Ned's grim mouth acknowledged that this old fear had walked back into their story. "Your wall," Ned said. Jon closed his eyes once as if to listen inward. The dream of ice stairs returned, not as lost this time, but as a call rung on metal. He opened them. "Our wall," he said, and the pronoun made something new in the room. The map unrolled again. All the river crossings and siege ladders and barley tallies remained where they were, necessary and immediate. But a new line appeared at the top of the world and an older line beneath their feet, where the roots of their vows reached. Jon laid his hand upon the painted stones of the wall. Margaery laid hers over his. They did not speak promises they might not be able to keep, not yet. They spoke only of sending riders to the mountain clans, of alerting White Harbor to store salt fish for men who would be far from hearths, of asking Howland Reed for truths old men had buried in marshes and might now need, however they smelled. That night Jon put down his quill beside a letter to Manderley about ship timbers and another to the Karstarks about arrow fletching. He took up a blank sheet and wrote to Samwell Tarly at the wall, because he had heard from the Umbers that a craven boy with a gentle mouth had found courage under stone so cold it cracked. He wrote, "Tell me what you see. Tell me when you breathe. Tell me when you cannot. We are building a hearth for winter. We will need it large." He sealed it with wax warmed over a candle Margaery had blown out, a warmth shared, and he gave it to a raven who tilted its head at him as if surprised to be sent where few birds dared. He went to their bed then, where Margaery slept with one hand open on the blanket as if to hold something she cared not to crush. He crawled in without waking her and lay on his side, watching the soft draw of her breath until his own matched it. Somewhere in the yard a guard coughed and a wolf replied with a low, affirming sound as if to say, "Yes, I am here." In another part of the castle Sansa walked past Arya's empty pallet and did not flinch before laying another blanket there against the night. On a road south of High Garden, Loras rode with his jaw set and his eyes bright with a destiny no one had written for him yet. On the neck, Howland Reed told his daughter a story of a wolf and a rose in a bog, and the girl laughed and pressed her hand to the mud to feel the world's damp pulse. At dawn Jon woke early and did not move. He lay and listened to snow ticking at the window and counted, not numbers but names. This was how you kept a realm from coming apart under the wind. You remembered who you held and who held you. He rose when Margaery stirred, and together they went downstairs to the day, which would demand too much and get almost enough. In the hall a boy with a wicker basket stood shuffling from foot to foot. He had come from the winter town with small loaves shaped like wolves for the lord and lady. He looked like someone who had run all the way because carrying good news is joy, whatever the news. Margaery knelt to his level and took a loaf and broke off a piece and ate it. "Warm," she said. The boy beamed, and the room warmed too. Work resumed. Letters flew. The road south to Maidenpool clotted with new schemes. More exchanges were proposed and refused. A single rumor from the capital arrived to slither under doors. That Cersei had chosen a husband for Margaery should she ever set foot within the Red Keep. Some lordling bred for golden obedience. And the rumor bore a footnote in smaller script that said Cersei's hand had been forced by whispers of incest made louder by a lady with thorny flowers on her embroidery. Margaery read, smiled very slightly, and set that letter under a mug to keep a draft from blowing out a candle. "Thorns first," she murmured, and returned to a ledger. At sunset Jon stood atop the east wall and watched a column of figures move toward the castle from the north. Riders in black furs with ravens circling, a banner flying the stark black of a brotherhood. He knew before he put the spyglass to his eye that it would be the Night's Watch in numbers not sufficient to ease any heart. He also knew that every man who came under his roofs would leave with something better than fear. He made space for that knowledge inside himself beside love and rage and all the other necessary fires. The first of the watchmen lifted a hand in salute when he saw the wolf and the rose fly. Jon returned it. "Bread for the wall," he called to the steward at his elbow, and the steward ran. Down in the yard, as the gates opened and the watchers rode in with faces gaunter than the stories ever drew them, Sansa came to stand beside her brother and looked upon the men she'd been taught to pity as criminals and to revere as guardians. She said very quietly, "Welcome home," and no one could have said to whom she spoke, perhaps to herself, perhaps to them, perhaps to Winter. Night would bring a council where old maps would be overlaid by older ones, where castles no courtier remembered would be named and stones no minstrel sang would be counted. Morning would bring lists, a different kind of poetry. Ghost would pace and glance to the north even when men spoke of south, and Jon would feel in his own bones the same tug. Margaery would send messengers to Old Town asking the Citadel for every scrap of lore on dragonglass and cold fire, and Lady Olenna's letter would arrive days later with a single line. If the night itself comes to dinner, set 2 plates and a trap beneath the table. They were not ready. No realm had ever been ready. They were building a readiness that looked like bread on tables and arrows fletched true and children taught to carry wood correctly and men taught to wait a long time before killing and a longer time after before drinking. They were building the kind of strength you could not count in lances at dawn. It had taken a marriage no bard expected to start it. It would require many more vows, some spoken, some carved in frost by breath and hoof. When sleep came to the castle that night, it did not come easy. Came in pieces, parceled out like rations. But when it did come at last, it found Jon and Margaery side by side, turned slightly toward each other without touching, the narrow span between them full of warmth enough to make the air their almost summer. Outside, snow whispered. Far beyond, something moved on the other side of a wall built by hands long dead. Inside, a fire ate willingly at a log and did not sputter. In that steady crackle, a small, stubborn thing grew. A belief that the day might be met and the night might be outlasted by people who stood together without pretending their knees did not shake. Somewhere in the wind, carried perhaps from farther east than anyone here had ridden, words thinned and became a sound that was not a threat but a reminder that all stories long enough bend Tawa. R.D. Winter and that some feet learned to dance on ice. And in Winterfell, where a rose and a wolf held house together, the rhythm for that dance was set, imperfect and resolute and human. Snow powdered the riders' cloaks as they swung down in the yard, black furs shedding flakes like ash shaken from a cold fire. The brothers wore no livery save the night's watch's color, and even that looked thinner than it should have upon men whose faces were wind-chapped and hollowed by long miles. Jon descended the steps with Ghost at his heel. Margaery came beside him, her hood pushed back so the men could see the Lady of Winterfell and judge for themselves the measure of welcome in her eyes. The leader stepped forward and unpinned his cloak. He was not a tall man, but the set of his shoulders told of years in armor. Frost had burned a permanent pallor into his cheeks. "Lord Stark," he said with a short bow. "Malador Locke, first ranger for the moment while others range. I bear Lord Commander Mormont's words and my own eyes." "Your eyes come first," Jon said. "Come to the fire and thaw them. Words can wait 2 breaths." They brought the watchman to the great hall's side hearth where steam rose from quilts drying on a line. A serving girl set out trenchers with goose and salt pork and a pot of onion broth that sweated fat in gold eyes across its surface. Ghost curled between table and wall, a white bracket around their guests. Malador Locke warmed his hands without shame. "I'll not dress it pretty," he said after his first mouthful. "We've seen dead men get up north of the wall in numbers that make old tales look like children's games. Mance Rayder pulls clans from caves by harp and promise. My lord, he gathers giants. I have no time for songs, and yet I tell you I heard drums in the Frostfangs that were not made by men." He glanced to Margaery then, as if weighing how far to spray fear in a hall that smelled of bread. "I am no nurse to frighten ladies. I say it because true." Margaery's mouth made a line that would look like softness to men who did not wish to see its iron. "I asked the Citadel for every scrap of writing on the long night," she said. "They sent me much contradiction and little humility. What they did not send, the old women of this town did. Instructions for warming stone floors and drying boots on slats and how to carry a man from snow without breaking him. I listened to both kinds of lore." She nodded toward the door. "You'll have boots and cloaks before you leave, and barley for your men. What else can we give that you lack?" Malador looked startled, not at the gift but at the question. He set down his spoon. "Oil for lamps on the wall, pitch for torches, twine, salt fish that keeps. Men, if you can spare any who don't mind vows that end with their bones in ice." His glance flicked to Jon. "I know you almost took the black. Jon felt the old pull then, a tug he had managed into an ache he could carry. He rested his hand on Ghost's head. "You'll have what we can send quickly and more after that. I'll ride north to see what else your Lord Commander needs." Ned, who had watched in his silence that was never empty, moved then. "He does not ride alone," he said. "This house stands now upon more than one pillar." He looked to Margaery, and in the look was the question of whether Winterfell's heart could leave its hall for a time without stopping. She answered by rising. "I'll go," she said simply. No one at the fire told her to remain south of the wall. Perhaps the room had already learned that telling roses where to grow was foolish. They left 4 days later with a lean escort chosen for quiet feet and broad backs. Robb rode with them as far as Queen's Crown, the ruins hunching black against a white day. There he and Jon clasped arms until it hurt and pretended that pain could stand in for the years that would pass too quickly or not at all. Sansa packed bread and dried pear herself into a satchel that hung from Margaery's saddle. She tucked 2 sprigs of winter savory inside and did not name them talismans. Ghost trotted ahead, the white of him vanishing into the white of the road and only the red of his eyes telling their company where the path lay. The mile markers of the kings of old rose half buried like teeth through snow. The land flattened and opened. The wind took nothing as excuse to run. On the 3rd day's noon the wall came into sight, blue-white under a low sun, stretching so indecently far in both directions that even men who had seen it once before felt their stomachs fall as if standing at the rim of a cliff. Margaery's horse tossed its head and snorted at the sudden shadow the thing cast. She patted its neck and did not speak. Jon watched her face, the way the work of it moved through her, and thought that here was the only place in the realm that did not care what men had written about it. If the gods made music, it had this in it, a note you heard in your bones whether you wanted to or not. Castle Black huddled like a handful of black chessmen at the wall's foot, with smoke from its chimneys shredded by winds before a man could bless it. The gate rose with a cable groan. Jorah Mormont met them in the yard, bearskin over chain, beard frosted. He gripped Jon's forearm as if testing the meat there and then looked to Margaery with a slight bow that honored both her and the way she sat her saddle. "You are far from hedgerows," he said, "and yet you came." "My grandmother says hedgerows hide snakes," Margaery answered. "I like my enemies where I can see them." The old bear's harsh chuckle blew steam. "I have those, and others you will not see until your throat is open." He turned and led them into his hall where the walls sweated a little from a fire that seemed inadequate and yet served. Brothers in black made room and watched the Lady of the Reach with a mix of hunger for novelty and suspicion of anything soft. She spoiled that suspicion by eating what they ate the way they ate it. When Mormont set his tin cup on the table's scarred wood with a thump, she matched it with her own. Samwell Tarly approached as timidly as a man might creep up on the idea that he had not failed. He was broader than he would ever not be, and his eyes were kinder than any soldier's ought, and when he recognized Margaery, he nearly dropped the ledger under his arm. "Sam," she said, her face blooming with recognition that was the opposite of courtly calculation. "I wondered whether our paths would cross before the snows decided everything themselves." He stammered and blushed and then found the voice his father had nearly chased from him. "My lady," he said, "my lord." He looked at Jon with something like reverence embarrassed into friendship. There was a raven's nest at the fist of the first men," he blurted. Not yet, but there will be. I had a dream of them all flying at once." He made a helpless gesture. "I write everything down. The maesters send books that do not answer questions." He thrust the ledger at Margaery as if she might be better at books than men who had donned chains. "Here. There are mentions of dragonglass. Obsidian. The children of the forest used it. Some say it breaks the cold ones. I don't know. It feels like someone else's plan. But plans are handy when night falls." Jon's hand found the ledger's weight with him. "We will find what we can," he said. "Skagos' cliffs are said to spit black glass. The Hightowers trade in curiosities from the smoking sea whether they admit it or not. If there's a shard to be had, we'll give it point." He looked to Jeor. Your men will need arrowheads and spear tips made thus. If it proves a child's fable, we lose time, not war. If it proves true, we gain mornings. Send me mornings, Mormont said dryly. I'll pay with crows and blood. He gestured to a blackened shape laid upon a stretcher near the far hearth. You asked what else I need besides twine. I need the realm to believe when a man says fire is the only funeral a dead man understands. Jon crossed to the thing and looked without flinching. The smell choked. The form on the stretcher had the wrong stillness. Its beard had burnt away to patchy stubble. Its fingers were claws now, tendons like harp strings exposed. A brother nearby crossed himself to the seven without apology, and then added a mutter to the old gods in case one ordinance covered what the other missed. We found it still walking 2 days after we put it down, the brother said, voice dry as old box. We learned quick now. He glanced at Margaery, apology in his face for making a lady see such. She did not flinch, only lifted fabric to cover her mouth and nose against the stink. Thank you, she said to the brother, and he blinked as if he'd expected scorn and found instead the thing that makes men stand their posts through 3 turns of the hourglass. They spent 2 days at the wall listening, watching, counting. Margaery walked the yard and the tunnels as if they were orchards to be pruned. She asked builders about mortar and sappers about the things that make walls crumble from the bottom up. She spent an hour with Donal Noy in the forge learning how much steel you lost when men sharpened it to nothing each day because they feared dullness more than exhaustion. She watched boys who had stolen 3 loaves or 3 sheep try to thrust strawboss swords at a sack and fail, and try again until the failures formed a rhythm that might one day become muscle memory. She stood beside Jon at the base of the wall and pressed her gloved palm to the blue ice. The cold bit through hide and wool and skin and stung the bones. She smiled at the pain with a strange satisfaction. It is honest, she said through her teeth. Always, Jon said, and looked up until his neck ached. It is the one thing in this realm that never lies. That night Gior called council in his solar, a cramped room layered with bare pelts and maps that shook a little in any breeze. He leaned over the table with fists on the wood. I ride in a fortnight, he said. I take the watch to the fist and feel what moves there. I do not ask permission. I ask only that you make the realm see that when I send ravens from the middle of the night, those birds carry more than crochet. They'll carry bread, Margaery said, and pitch, and men. And if they carry ash, the ash will be men who burned where they stood, on their feet. Gior's hard eyes softened by a degree. They told me the rose girl would be soft, he said, almost amused. They forget roots find stone and split it. I like you here well enough, my lady. I will like you better in Old Town's counting rooms with a ledger whip. Roots like coin, Margaery said, and the old bear laughed. Afterwards, in the dimness of their guest cell, Jon sat on the pallet with his elbows on his knees. The forge's faint ringing came like a small bell through the stones. Ghost lay across the threshold as if the door were his to bless or bar. Margaery unpinned her hair and let it fall. It took the cold and made it look warm. I see the boy you would have been, she said into the quiet. Ghost's tracks in new snow and you behind him with your face lifted to the wind and your hands raw and your heart so full you could not speak for it. I still cannot speak for it, he admitted, surprised by the ease of confession. He scrubbed at his eyes with the heel of his palm as if the cold had got inside. It calls. It will always call. But the thing it asks of me, I can answer from where I stand now. She came to sit beside him, thigh to thigh, and leaned her temple against his shoulder. Then we stand, she said. And they sat like that a long while, and the forge bell quieted and came again and stopped, and the night went on. A brother died that night. Not here. A raven arrived before dawn from a way station beyond the Shadow Tower, carrying a strip of parchment that named a man Margaery had seen in the yard practicing cuts, as if he could reduce death to a diagram. The message said only he had not returned from a piss and had been found again walking and had been set to true rest. Jon stood with Gior while the old bear read the little word twice and set the paper down with the gentleness a man reserves for newborns and for names that will no longer answer. We burn wood like a kingslayer now, Gior said. We will need men who know where to cut peat without drowning us all. Send me cutters. Send me men who grew up with candles made from tallow and who do not waste a stub." He looked at Jon. "Send me your women who know wool and can make a man's shoulders a place the wind cannot find." The old bear had learned, as all true commanders do, that wars are won by the people who do not know their names will ever be sung. Margaery nodded and wrote a list that night by their cot. Women in the winter town who made fleets from thread and saved lives with needles. Names gleaned from the kitchen. Grandmothers like little fortresses whose hands had woven shawls as clever as chainmail. They left at noon under a sky that had frozen to glass. Sam came as far as the gate with them, walking quickly to keep warm. He pressed the ledger into Jon's hands. "There's more in there than I wrote," he said apologetically, and then his mouth tilted. "There always is. That's why we write. I'll send you paper that doesn't go limp when you look at it," Margaery promised, and he laughed in a shocked way, as if kindness were a language he had not expected to hear spoken out loud here. At the last, at the gate itself, he blurted, "I will send ravens to you, my lady, with what we learn and what hurts and what doesn't. If they don't come back, I will write another and another until one finds you." She put her gloved hand briefly around his, and he colored with the intensity of a boy spared a blow. "I will read each one," she said, and the promise steadied him like a hand to his back. The road south from the wall looked like a long white yes carved into the world. It was easier to ride down it than up. The wind at their backs helped, the horses pulling homeward with the particular eagerness animals have when stables lie ahead. Margaery grew quiet as Winterfell's towers swam into view. It was not dread. There was no fear that the home would refuse her, but an awareness that something inside her had shifted at the wall and must find a new seat when she sat on other chairs. Sansa met them at the gate. She had taken to wearing a hood rimmed in rabbit fur that made her look younger from far off and older near. Grief always netted both ages together in the same small face. She asked 1,000 questions and then none, listening keenly when Jon spoke of men with black cords at their wrists and of a dead man on a stretcher who was never going to be a man again. She did not flinch. Somewhere in the missing months, a softness designed for court had hardened to something else. She held Jon's arm a long while in the hall and didn't realize her fingers had made crescents in the wool until she saw him glance at them and take her hand and rub them smooth again. Letters met them. One from Lady Olenna written as if it were a recipe, perhaps because servants might carry it. In the margin, a neat notation. Cersei's wine cellar cheats her. This is an opening. Another from White Harbor in Wyman's fat hand, announcing the arrival of Associ merchants offering crates of black glass trinkets for ladies' mantles and gentlemen's cabinets. Margaery read that last twice and laughed once. A sound of clean delight. "Trinkets can be arrowheads with enough heat," she said. She sent a rider that evening in the dark to bid Manderley buy every trinket he could lay fat fingers upon and not to haggle over much lest the Associ smell a new market and run. She wrote to Old Town where Hightower clerks prided themselves upon curios. She wrote underneath the pride as if it were a floor and not a wall. "We have use for your baubles," she said, and that phrasing would skewer a dozen men who despised to be called bauble sellers into handing over black glass and calling it duty. From the south, the news came in clumps and clatter. Tywin had shifted westward and then back. Stannis had burned the 7 at Dragonstone and then lost half a fleet and then taken a castle that had previously mattered and now only mattered because men wanted to say they had taken it. The Iron Throne still listed, but it had not yet capsized. From the east, where no raven had any business, came stories that smelled like lamp oil. Dragons reborn across a desert. A girl with silver hair walking through fire with 3 hatchlings clinging to her like night moths. Jon filed that with other tales that hung in the air like breath in frost. Surprising to see, easy to forget until it killed you later for laughing. Theon began to skulk like a dog too proud to be a dog. He watched the ships from White Harbor, the way oars bit water and left clean runnels, and paced his chamber until the rugs memorized his steps. Jon found him one evening in the practice yard striking at a post with an edge he had not earned that day. "Your sword holds anger poorly," Jon said without heat, slipping out of his cloak. "And yours holds it like a lover," Theon snapped. and then grimaced as if his own words turned bitter in his mouth. He leaned on his sword with an ugly sort of grace. My father's ravens stopped coming 2 winters ago. When I walk the yard, men say Stark's ward, like it's my given name. Names can be changed, Jon said. We do it here with letters, and with deeds when letters fail. He weighed what he would risk by saying more. He had learned to see Theon. His loneliness braided so tightly into arrogance a knife would be dull before it cut either. If you would be seen as Ironborn and not as a dog on Winterfell's chain, ride to Pike and bring us your father's true word, he said. Not as a hostage, as a son. Return with ships that guard our coasts, and I will call you by a name you like when men listen. Theon's eyes went dark with the way hope turns on itself when it learns it may be fed. And if Balon spits in my face? He asked. Then you will know what face is worth spitting, Jon said, and Theon laughed in a burst against his will, like a bark broken by joy. I will ride, he said, if only because I tire of the smell of rabbit stew. He sobered then. If I do not return, don't remember me for my worst story. He did not wait for answer. He turned and strode away with the gait of a man walking toward an execution he would trick into becoming a coronation. When he had gone, Margaery stepped from the shadow of an arch and set her palm on Jon's chest without speaking. He covered it with his own. I give him rope that might be a bridge or a noose, he said. I will not know which until the knot catches. It is how men become more than what their first day promised, she said. You gave him a choice. His ache will do the rest. More letters came, like geese in crooked V's. One from Tyrion, short as a dagger. Your sister pretends to sleep with her eyes open. She hears steps everywhere. She will step into a pit and call it a dance floor. Later, another from Baelish, pretty as honey and twice as sticky, laying cunning compliments at Margaery's feet and inviting the coalition to place coin in ventures that smelled so faintly of rot it would take a butcher's nose to catch it. Margaery scribbled in the margin. Vines grow up a trellis or they strangle it. We'll build our own. She sent back a box of lemons and a note that read only, for your sour schemes. He answered with citrus candied so perfectly even Ned smiled when he took one. A man could appreciate craft even when it hid poison. Winter pressed its palm harder. Men began to talk less in yards and more. Eat in storerooms. Margaery formed a committee of women from houses great and small to run a garment hall where cloaks were stitched in rows that looked like prayers laid flat. She asked the women to sew small green stitches hidden inside each garment, a signature only their own fingers would know. You'll need that mark when the knight tries to tell you you did nothing today, she said, and some looked away quickly so strangers would not see pride. Jon drilled levy boys until their shoulders learned how a shield lives. He matched reach riders and umbers in pairs and sent them out to escort caravans and had them exchange saddles for 2 miles so each learned the other's work. The first day there were bruised egos and bruised animals. By the third, the laughter in the yard had found a new chord that rang clearer. Gior's raven came with snow clotted in its feathers, beating at the glass as if it knew a window and forgot it. The Lord Commander's hand was cramped. The ink blotted where the bird's body shook the page as it wrote. He called them brothers, though one of them wore a lady's gowns and others wore no black. The letter said the fist had been taken by a storm from no direction men could name. It said torches burned blue. It said names of men Jon did not know, and one he did because Sam had written it once before in a note. He was alive but scattered with 2 men in a wood of resin that did not burn. The letter ended with a request that was not a request. Send us glass. Send us fire. Send us men who can stand together without clutching each other to the ground. They sent what could move through snow. Manderley's captains cursed in wonder at the weight of black glass crates. They packed them in straw and held those crates like they held their sons' heads when the boys were little and fevered, carefully, with a fear that steadied rather than shook. Maester Luwin devised kills to anneal the glass so it would not shatter when the cold took it too fast. Donal Noy's apprentices learned the trick of seating such arrowheads in ash shafts without splitting the wood. Margaery stood in the heat of the smithy until her cheeks burned and then went out to the yard where the air stabbed and laughed at the idiocy of a world that asked you to master 2 pains at once. Ghost grew restless that week, stalking the shadows of Winterfell as if the stones carried foreign scents. Twice at night, Jon woke to the direwolf standing in the open window with his head tilted to the north and a sound building in him that was not a growl and not a cry but something the body used when words could not fit. Jon put his hand on the thick fur that ran along Ghost's back and felt every muscle quiver in a way no training could teach a dog. "I know," he said into the fur and the cold air both. "It's coming." He lay awake afterward thinking of a wall across which wolves could not send warnings that men would understand. A blink of the story, far south and alone. Arya Stark crouched in a ditch with water freezing and thawing by degrees in her boots with each hour, and held a knife with a chipped tip and thought of a rose and a wolf standard someone had described once in a smoky room and decided not to die that night. She did not know her brother had been in Maidenpool with her down the lane, 2 months skewed. She did not know she had passed a cart carrying quills and glass headed north to dresses that would never warm her. She made a face no one saw and whispered the list that ate sleep and kept her strong. And when dawn came thin and ugly, she went on. The snows eased for 3 days. The sky became a thin blue stretched tight between pale horizons. That was when the first of the wildlings came, not as enemy but as shadow. A ragged family north of Deep Lake stumbled into a forester's path, dragging a sled with a bundle that turned out to be a grandmother who could not walk. They spoke a northern tongue older than any maester's Latin and had carved charms of bone to keep their blood warm that had failed at last. "Mance said south," the father said when a soldier with a green thread sewn inside his cloak stooped to give the boy a drink. "He said the wall keeps worse than men." Jon rode out to the place where the forester waited with his bow lowered. He looked at the family a long time. Then he examined the charms and the sled and the blistered feet. "Bring them in," he said. "Dragons and kings are too busy to guard children." The choice made a bruise on someone's pride each day, on a man from the Dreadfort who hissed that wildlings raided his father's cattle 30 years, on a woman from the Barrowlands whose sister had married a man and found him a crow and found him a thief. Margaery took 2 of the wildling women into the garment hall and set them to work with a needle. They did not know the southern names for stitches. Their hands learned quickly anyway. "Thread is thread," she said to the woman who supervised and who had pursed her mouth until her lips turned white. "So is winter." From Highgarden a tremor. Mace had proposed to send a cousin to Casterly Rock with casks of summer wine and a son of Florent to seal a treaty with. The rest of the sentence dissolved into abandonment when Lady Olenna put a stop to it with a phrase Jon later read and admired as a piece of warcraft. "Dearest, we do not provide grapes to a man you intend to strangle later with a vine." Margaery's reply, lighter, landed like a needle through skin. "Grandmother, don't say strangle in a letter. We'll need this page for posterity. Underneath, I have secured from Old Town a consignment of black glass carved as saints' tears. The faith will bless them when they see the color. They will bless our arrowheads when they fail to recognize them too." Robb sent word from the Trident that Edmure had blooded his nose against the Green Fork yet held the lines. Walder had sent not sons but grandsons with 2 easily broken honor. He asked for grain and got it without being asked twice. He asked for news of Arya and got instead the truth that they had not found her. The parchment carried pressed into it a hair that had fallen from Sansa's brush and that Margaery had tucked into the fold without quite meaning to, as if to say, "Here is a piece of your sister you can carry." Robb wrote back a single line beneath signatures and plans, and it was not war at all. "Tell Sansa I remember the song she sang about the apple tree and mother cried. Tell her I will bring her a branch if I can." On a morning when the frost on the glass garden panes looked like ink drawings of ferns too delicate to exist, Margaery sat with Catelyn in the warm damp air among winter apples and chamomile that refused to die. They spoke of small things, which meant they were trying not to injure large ones with the handling. Catelyn's hands, moving over a napkin, hesitated and then settled without trembling. "I think of the South," she said, tone careful. "And I think of all its laws about names and women. And I sit here with you and I think of north wind blowing through those laws like they were never mortared." She looked at Margaery directly. "I did not want you in my hall. I wanted quiet for my own. Now I want you here because you make noise that frightens off worse beasts." Margaery reached and set her hand over Catelyn's in a gesture that held no victory. "I will try," she said. Caitlin nodded. Try is all we're offered. The gods have better work than to guarantee. At dusk that same day, a courier staggered in from the east road with his horse lathered into foam and his own face chalky. He bore a message pinned with a splinter of bone. It was from a watchpost above Queen's Crown, and it carried no salutation. Fires on the hills in patterns we set for warning. Something moves in the woods without sound. We burned a corpse that did not bleed. Send back answer on arrow fletching, we spend arrows like harvest. Jon read it twice and handed it to Margaery, who read it once and folded it along the crease she had made with her nail because paper remembers where it learned to bend. They built beacons. It was not a grand thing to sing of, and so they did it well. Masons raised cairns in view of one another across ridges. Boys carried bundles of kindling wrapped in wax cloth to keep it from drinking the snow. Old men took up duties to stand nights when younger shoulders had to sleep before they met day. Sansa embroidered a strip of green into each watchman's scarf and did not explain when asked why, and the old men touched those strips sometimes as if rumor said they warmed more than wool could. Ghost began to make a new map of the north with his feet, ridge paths that took him from beacon to beacon under moonlight. The men at the beacons started keeping scraps of meat in pocket for him. They called him Snow's Shadow. More than once his presence between two fires stopped a voice from turning into fear. Patches of the story far away kept lighting. A Lannister rider slipping on ice and breaking a neck, and a letter scattering from his pouch with a seal half broken. A woman at Stony September teaching her child to count in beans by two and telling him each bean stood for a man who did not come home. Tyrion in a tower room pressing two fingers into his temples and imagining the shape of a world built on debts and finding that in his head at least it made more sense for wolves and roses to rule coin than lions. On a day of blue so hard even the ravens seemed to clatter through it. Another raven came and beat against the glass until blood dabbed the pane. Carried only a name scratched in haste. Half-hand. Jon stared at the strokes and felt in his marrow the way a thing waits in a wood and does not breathe until the knife passes. He sent back a message that said nothing useful and everything necessary. We see you, we move our hands. He felt young, and then he felt exactly his age. That night he and Margaery ate standing in the kitchen because food came hot there and did not cool crossing halls. Steam rose from cabbage stew. A fat from some simmered joint shimmered on top. They stood with wooden bowls and bumped shoulders and let the heat into their faces and did not talk about the letter. Finally Margaery said, "There are moments when I want the gods to reach down and arrange." She smiled with self-mockery in it. "Then I remember arranging is our lot." Jon leaned his hip against the table and thought of arranging men, wood, glass, words. "And when we cannot arrange," he said, "we endure." Theon's absence blew a draft under the door that made tapestries stir in odd, private ways. Days threw themselves forward, one after the other, and then a night came down as calm as glass. Sleep held the castle like a patient dog holds a rabbit. Careful, proud, with the understanding that it will put it down when called. In that sleep, a woman in the winter town who had worked her hands raw sewing cuffs remembered a girl's face she had once seen bending over a book in a warm room, and woke and did not know why she was weeping. In that same night, in a place far from any watchfire, a man with a crown in his mind and a god in his blood dreamed of a snow that would not melt under any sun, and his dream made him reach for a sword on the wall where it hung too high for him to take it down in time. Dawn came as it always does, without apology. The hall smelled of porridge and ashes and wet wool. Jon came down the stair with wool not quite dry around his shoulders and Margaery with her hair in a rough plait she had not smoothed yet, and they took their places at a table and ate burnt edges because the burnt edges went to the house, and that is what lords and ladies who keep their house strong do. Maester Luwin brought a sheaf of letters and set them down as if the weight might break fingers. He did not flinch when it did not. One of the letters bore a seal he recognized now by how his jaw clenched when he saw it. Hightower's white castle tower on its field, crisp as discipline. They had sent, at last, a ledger of what ships might be spared should the bite glaze over, which warehouses could be commandeered by clerks who did not ask too many questions when told whose coffers would repay. They had also sent a small package with it, a piece of glass not black but green, from old Valyria by the note, said to hold in it the image of a city that had drowned. Margaery held the glass up to the small morning and peered through it and shook her head softly. "It makes this room look underwater," she said. "We'll cut it down for someone's knife if it breaks the cold." She set it aside with reverence and disinterest, married, like a good wife and a husband who would never be unfaithful only because he forgot what he had promised. They kept at it. That is the dull sentence you write when you do not yield to the urge to make everything important into a turning. The turns came anyway. A boy learning to carry a hod of wood correctly and not twist his back. A woman deciding one winter not to sell her daughter's hair to buy flour because flour would come. A watchman lighting a beacon and not dying that night because light made a thing stop just long enough for men to get spears into their hands. Old gods and new both fed on such moments whether they admitted it. The summons south arrived like a stone dropped in a bucket whose surface had almost stilled. It carried the wax of a stag and the hand that had learned to write while drunk on power. It said that Cersei Lannister would hold parley at Harrenhal over the matter of prisoners and grain, and a line of succession no one now respected in the way they had respected the thing they pretended to respect before. It said, "Come or stay, and you will own the consequence." Ned read it and looked at his hands. "She cannot hold a parley without turning it into a pageant," he said. "I have no time for pageants. But sometimes men write laws by wearing pretty clothes." He looked to Margaery. "If we go, we bring thorns." She smiled and did not show teeth. "I have a basket." They would go, not to supplicate but to count. They would leave Robb where war still moved and Sansa where house still needed a face that could be both stern and soft. They would ride with a small company of men who had learned that sometimes most blades cut paper clean. Ghost would go because he went where Jon went. The North carried its old stories with it like a man who keeps a knife in his boot no matter what feast he attends. The night before they left, Margaery walked the Gods Wood alone and then not alone. Sansa found her there. The fur at her hood rhymed with stars. She stood where the weirwood's red dripped. "If you are playing at court with the lions," Sansa said softly, "and they try to play with you, do not sing their songs back to them. Sin mine." Margaery nodded once. "I learned a new song at the wall," she said. "It has no words. I think the lions cannot hear it. That is a comfort." Sansa lifted her hands and pressed them against the weirwood and whispered with her eyes closed for a long time. When she opened them, she smiled in a way no man in court would understand. "Mother says to bring back nothing you cannot carry yourself," she said, and they both laughed, low and warm in the winter. Then they went back into the castle and packed small things. A needle and thread and a knot of bread and letters folded so many times the creases knew where to fall. They rode at first light. The road south looked like a statement written in snow. Their breath plumed together like two banners that would not tangle in the wind no matter how the gusts chose to turn. Behind them, Winterfell's walls carried their warmth inside like an oven banked at night. Before them, Harrenhal lifted its ruined towers out of morning mist the way an old tale lifts itself out of a child's mouth and becomes something the whole room must turn to hear. The world went on being too large and too small in the same breath. They went on anyway. Ghost went on ahead and came back and went again, riding the path into the snow so other feet could find it later. They rode under a sky the color of blade steel, thin light catching on the iced edges of reeds that lined half-frozen streams. The road south grew meaner with each mile. Wagon ruts hardened to ribs under the hoofs beat. Villages lay more often burned than lived in, hedges blackened, orchards pruned by fire not hand. Men in patched cloaks watched from behind fallen stone and did not step out. Sometimes they lifted a hand in a gesture so tentative it might have been a twitch, and Jon lifted his in answer because he had learned a greeting could be a kind of food. Harrenhal rose from marsh mist, not so much a castle as a wound the world refused to scab. The melted towers curved like talons. The bones of the great hall poked at the sky like ribs of a creature that had gone to rot and stubbornly refused to fall. Rooks spiraled in a dark halo. The nearer they drew, the more the place stank of old fire and horse piss and the damp that comes from stone remembering heat it can never forget. Banners flapped in a wind that never seemed to rest here. The Lannister lion crisp and smug, the stag stitched beside in thread that had frayed with too many cold hands raising it. A handful of lesser sigils stapled to the day with iron pins. There was a dais raised beneath the burned vaults, draped with cloth of gold that glimmered like a lie. Men said Cersei Lannister would sit behind a gauze screen there, the queen regent in state, her face a coin held up to sun. Men made many sayings. Jon had learned to bow to what waited and not to the stories that heralded it. At the gate, the captain who checked their escort never once looked Margaery in the eye. He kept his gaze where a man thinks safety lives. At hands, at hips, at the place where a wolf's shadow moves. Ghost stood too still behind Jon's knee, so white he hurt to look at. Red gazed steady. The captain's mouth thinned. He waved them through as if he opened not a gate but his own chest. In the yard, men stacked straw bales and practiced dummies and threw spears in slow arcs. Their breath plumed from leather masks. The heat of too many bodies lingered in corners with the smell of flour, dust, and damp wool. Rumor moved like mice within walls. A kitchen girl carrying a bucket of swill whispered that the queen drank wine flavored with rose petals to fix her humor to the parley. A boy with dead skin peeling from his lips swore he had seen a pale woman with red hair walking the ramparts at dawn. There is always a pale woman, Jon thought, and a boy hungry enough to believe anything he can raise his voice to tell. In the castle's veined bowels, a girl with her hair hacked off to wolfish tufts slid between pies cooling on racks and swore when grease hissed onto her wrist. The cook slapped her head without looking and the girl swallowed the yelp. Arya Stark had learned the language of not being seen until it played in her bones. She moved with it through Harrenhal like air in a flute. Men in gold cloaks had come and gone. Men with goat beards, louts with plates, smooth-faced boys who wore sadness like signet rings. She had measured them for danger and snuck between their ankles. 3 names had purchased her a debt, and she had spent them one by one, the taste of iron pennies on her tongue after each. She had not wasted the 3rd. Not yet. Better to hoard a single good nail in a ruined house until the wind came screaming. When word of the parley slithered into the kitchens like a wet cat, Arya stood very still with her scarred hands around a wooden bowl. The cook noticed nothing. Arya let the bowl hang until her knuckles went white. Jon. She did not dwell on the picture of him her mind first produced. A boy all edges, sword twice, laughter rare and bright as coins. She pressed tea into her chest and knotted it there. Later, she told herself, and then added the truth that had kept her alive. Or not at all. Jaqen H'ghar found her by the scullery door, his hair half red, half white, as if 2 men had finished a fight and both claimed victory. He smelled of ash and some soft herbal thing that made thoughts turn slippery. A girl wears a face like bread gone to crumbs, he said, his voice the wind in a well. Does she hunger? She hungers for words, Arya muttered. But the only words here are lies. A lie is a word with a knife in it, Jaqen murmured. Such words can be useful. His eyes, black as ink that had been spilled on a floor and dried into the wood, took her in as if weighing a recipe. A man owes a girl nothing now. Debts paid. A girl may find a coin in her pocket all the same if she hunts where men do not sweep. He tilted his head toward the side passage that led to the jailer's stair. A girl knows how to send a bird that does not fly. Arya did not nod. She ran. Down the stair that stank of piss and secrets. Along the corridor where rats had made maps of their own in droppings and gnawed candle stubs. She had a sliver of parchment stolen from a steward. She had charcoal saved from burned bread. Her hands shook more from rage than from fear. Beware the dais, she scratched, letters jagged as teeth. They mean to spring trap with green fork men behind the screens. Beware gut strings under the rushes. She stared at the last line until it steadied under her. Jon. It was still a boy name laid against a man. She folded the slip and jammed it into a crack at the base of the 3rd stair, the crack the rats used. She whispered the rat a favor it could spend later in the gods' narrow market. On the yard above, Jon and Margaery stood beneath the melted arch that led to the great hall and tried not to look impressed by ruin. Ned stood a pace behind, his cane more balanced than crutch now. The guards announced them with voices that echoed strangely, the melted stone making a music none of them spoke. They entered into a room where fire pits had been dug into the floor to warm the space and had bled smoke up a shaft so the roof looked like winter night after a battle. streaks and smuts and a patch where something had burned too clean to leave ash. On the dais behind a gauze screen hung with gold, a woman's silhouette sat very straight. On either side of the screen stood white cloaks. Ser Meryn Trant stolid as an ox in his armor, Ser Boros blunt with a gut that peeped where plates gaped. In front of the screen, Kevan Lannister stood in plain steel to prove he still remembered war enough to wear it. His face mild and irritated by mildness. Adam Marbrand flanked him, the trick of command sitting on him like a cloak he had tailored himself. At Kevan's right, small as an accusation, Tyrion Lannister leaned on a stick and watched the room as if he were counting debts and finding pleasure in the tallies. "The North attends," Kevan said, inclining his head. "The Reach attends where it can." He did not say you should be elsewhere. He did not say this hall belongs to my brother and his will. He did stop aware of the wolf at Jon's leg and the rose stitched in ghost thread along Margaery's cloak hem. That stitch was not for other eyes. It mattered anyway. Margaery's curtsy was deep enough to be read as grace and not so deep as to be read as plea. Jon's bow was as brief as courtesy permitted. He had practiced that with Maester Luwin under the Maester's disapproving eye. A lord who had to learn manners on purpose must be careful where he used them. Ned's inclination carried Winterfell's weight. When he straightened, men in the hall who remembered what it had meant to ride under his command found their hands had fallen lightly to their sword hilts without thought. Cersei's silhouette did not move. "Queen Regent," Jon said, addressing the screen and not the men who stood in front of it. "Lord Kevan, Ser Adam, Lord Tyrion, we come to discuss bread, blood, and children. The order is important." Kevan's mouth quirked. Tyrion's did more than quirk. The gauze yielded only a shadow when the voice came through. "We will speak of loyalty," Cersei said. Her tone was warm as wine going sour. "Loyalty to a crown and to the idea of a crown. I see before me rebels who call themselves gardeners and butchers. I see a bastard in a cloak stitched by a seamstress who learned her craft in a barn. Do I see men of the realm? Convinceme." Jon took one step forward. The hush that fell had the hush's own weight. He could hear water drip behind a wall somewhere, counting the beats of his heart for him. "Your Grace," he said, and even men who despised the word heard the sincerity in it. "Respect for the office, not for the throat that used it. We bring you proof of loyalty. Grain saved and sent to Duskendale's storehouses and King's Landing's poor. Merchants protected on roads stamped flat by winter. If loyalty is measured by who eats." Cersei laughed, a bright, brittle sound that startled the rooks on the roof into a single wing cough. "Loyalty is measured by who kneels," she said, "by who bows when gold walks past. Bread is for bellies. Loyalty is for crowns. Crowns break if bellies empty," Margaery said, her voice liquid and cold in the same breath. She did not raise it. The words carried because the room wanted them. "It is winter's first lesson. The second is that men do not kneel to a head on a spike. That is a lesson we do not teach here. We would rather bake." Tyrion's shoulders rocked minutely. Kevan's eyes went to him as if to demand an extra inch of patience. He turned back to the dais. "Terms," he said flatly. "We will list them plainly. The Crown recognizes the North's admin." Ghost's head came up, ears pricking. The cartilages canted as if he listened to a sound no human ear could catch. He moved a pace to the left and pressed against Jon's thigh. Jon tensed. A breath later he felt the wrongness in the rushes under his boots, the faintest tautness where there should be sag. A whisper line that ran between two posts and sang when the weight of a step went near. He shifted lightly. Margaery did the same without needing warning, her footfall turning and lifting with the neat economy of a dancer avoiding a bad board. Ned caught the motion a heartbeat later and set his cane down elsewhere than his eye had promised. At the dais, Kevan's mouth thinned. He flicked a glance past Tyrion. Adam Marbrand's hand closed on nothing and opened again, as if to remeasure a sword he was not presently drawing. Jon let nothing change in his face. He lifted his chin a fit at Tyrion. The dwarf's eyes narrowed. He had not said this. That much was stone. Someone had. At that moment, a man in a mottled green and brown cloak moved along the far wall, as if he were part of the wall. He stooped and plucked something from between two stones and rose fluid as smoke. He was one of Jon's archers, Lowen, who never boasted about the goats he had raised and had learned patience from beasts. In his fingers lay a slip of grubby parchment. He didn't read it. He moved as if a chill had tugged his shoulders and walked the long way around the wrongness and came to stand behind Jon. He did not speak. He lifted the note and tilted it, and Jon took it the way a man takes a small thing and makes it heavy. Beware gut strings under the rushes. He did not let his face move. He did not let his eyes seek the base of the stair, the crack a rat might run. He folded the note into his palm and closed his hand until the paper warmed there. "We each carry a thing the other wants," he said, as if resuming a conversation rudely interrupted by air. "You want levies to march when you whistle. I want citizens fed when they wait. You want a path for your gold to travel without bandits prying open sacks. I want a way to get black glass north without censors asking what saints' tears are for. We can exchange these things like gentlemen, or we can fight like people who crave death. My preference is the former. My capacity is for both." Cersei shifted behind her veil, a shadow bending a little. A woman who thrived on stagecraft does not easily accept a scene that belongs to someone else. "You speak beyond your boot heels," she said, but there was less music in it. She could taste how the room had tilted. Tyrion leaned forward. "Bread buys peace more cheaply than swords," he said lightly. "A truth written in dusty corners and rarely read. My sister prefers swords. I prefer bread. Sometimes I prefer nooses made of bread. It makes the body last longer. Let us say the crown recognizes a, what shall we call it, supply corridor. In exchange, the coalition acknowledges Joffrey's claim to sit a chair carved to look like what it is. In exchange for that exchange, we exchange prisoners. Words and sons and daughters are all hostages to fortune. Let us make them hostages to paper." Ned shifted his weight. "Names," he said. "You talk of prisoners like grain. Name them. I will hear your price measured in people and answer in kind." Cersei's voice came mild. "The Riverlands hostages taken during Tywin's righteous campaign. 12 at least. A score if I feel generous. Sansa Stark you have. Arya Stark you do not, and neither do we. A Fry grandson from Riverrun's kitchens who was too slow and is too valuable for my father to kill. Lords whose names you do not love, who will be better husbands if their wives see daylight before summer. And from you," the veiled head tilted, "I would have a public renunciation from the reach of the foolish claim that wolves and roses might tangle and make a hedge between kings. I would have grain in fact and not in song. I would have—" "Enough," Kevin said, and there was a front of quiet in it that made the room set down its jest for a breath. He looked at Jon and at Margaery. "Do not demand of the crown a thing it cannot give. The queen cannot say in this hall, before these men, that she will not send Tywin Lannister into the Riverlands again. That is what a Lannister prince does. But I can, in this hall, say that the small folk will be spared when lions go hunting. Put it in ink and we'll grind the wax." Margaery's gaze did not leave the gauze. "There is another thing the crown cannot give yet must receive," she said. "Winter is here. The Night's Watch asks glass that breaks cold. If you prefer stories to the sight of what walks, send a singer north and see if his throat survives. The coalition will send glass north. The crown will not impede. The crown will, in fact, pay for it, if only to persuade the Citadel that this is a matter for men in rings and not women in shawls." A small exhalation ran through the hall like dry leaves moved by a lizard. Tyrion's mouth made a shape that might have been respect and might have been the face a man assumes when he realizes some woman has set his chess pieces 2 moves ahead of him. "The Citadel," he murmured. "And here I thought our parley would be simple." He tapped his stick. "Let us draft terms before too many wrong feet find too many gut strings." Behind the gauze, the queen raised her hand to her throat and made a motion that could have been a sign to a servant or a delicate scratch. Men around her read it as both. The table was brought, parchment set, sealing wax warmed. While scribes rasped, Jon stepped back and to the side. turned one way to speak to Ned and another to confer with Margaery. In one of those half-turns, he saw a shadow in the doorway shift the way only a body shifts when it belongs to someone who knows how to vanish. For a half-breath, his heart left him. Arya moved her head a fraction, and he saw her mouth make two syllables he could not hear and that he would feel forever. Not yet. Then she was gone, swallowed by the castle's belly, and the ache that ripped through him left him clearer than grief sometimes does. If she was alive and moving, she was dangerous. If she was dangerous, she was moving toward them by a path they could not safely walk to reach her. He tapped his palm where the folded warning rested and made himself learn its edges with his skin. Not all rescues are done by men with swords. Some are done by girls with knife-chipped names and rats listening. Ink scratched. Tyrion dictated the clauses with a sloppiness that hid care. The line about glass went in, cleverly as a ledger entry shuffled between dwarfish jokes. The line about prisoners did not name names with titles. It spelled them with letters that could be denied later in court. The line about the corridor bore upon it two seals, Wolf and Rose impressed together. It would look pretty on a hallway wall if men lived to build a hallway. Cersei signed behind her screen after a long pause that tasted in the air like a stampede that stops at a cliff. Kevin pressed the seals. Jon affixed Winterfell's. Margaery set a seal on behalf of Highgarden that would make her father purse his mouth and then spend 2 hours explaining why it was clever. When they stood from the table, Adam Marbrand drew close to Jon under the pretense of admiring the wolf badge. His breath smelled of cloves covering something older. "Keep that beast chained," he said mildly. "Eyes on Ghost and nowhere else. Men who habitually share a bed with their shadows forget which is which and go mad." Jon looked at the melted towers, at the rooms where men had roasted in their ropes because someone wanted to make a point about dragons. "Madness is something your house knows," he said, equally mild. Adam's eyes cooled by a degree. Then he nodded, as if to acknowledge the fee charged for the insult, and stepped away. They left Harrenhal with parchment in a tube and a silence in their company where the laughter would have gone if laughter had not been embarrassed to visit that place. Ghost did not stop glancing back until the blackwood rose swallowed the castle. Snow fell again in small dry flakes that stung when they hit bare skin, little truths the wind insisted upon telling. At a ford where the water ran black under a skin of ice, a messenger caught up with them, the horse blowing and the man's lips split. He bore a strip of cloth tied with a length of golden hair. Jon's fingers went cold before he opened the knot, colder after. The ribbon cut from the queen's head meant the deal stood for a day. It might not stand tomorrow. It was what passed for a truce now. A woman sacrificing a piece of herself that would grow back to show good faith that would not. That night by the fire, Margaery warmed her hands, and then her cup, and then her hands again. She stared at the space above the flames where smoke blurred the world into manageable edges. "She will try to kill me," she said without sadness. It had the tone of noting where a rock lay on a path. "She will try to kill what you represent," Jon said. "It is less personal and more deadly." "Then we turn personal," Margaery said. "Personal saves more often than righteous." She lifted her eyes. "Your sister was there." Jon's answer was a breath that carried a name without letting it escape. "Not yet," he said with a grin that was not laughter and killed nothing. He added, more for himself, "She left a message about rushes." "Of course she did," Margaery murmured. "She always hated carpet you can't see under." In Pike the air tasted like knives and old oil. The sea flung itself against the rocks as if it had not learned from last time, as if this time it would succeed in breaking the island into a necklace of stones it could wear. Theon stepped from the longship into a slop of fish scales and foam and grinned because it was that or bare his throat. He had expected to feel the old rod of pride slide up his spine. He felt instead the complicated ache of a man walking into a childhood room and finding the ceiling lower than memory. Balon Greyjoy received him in a chamber that had been designed to make men cold and smaller. He sat beneath antlers and iron hooks and a driftwood chair carved to look like it had been stormed into shape and then remembered it needed to be used. His beard had gone to wire. His eyes had not softened. "The wolf sends his hound back with a note in his mouth," he said without greeting. How do you like your collar, boy? The answer Theon had practiced tasted like charcoal in his mouth. He spat it out anyway. I wear no collar, he said. I come as son. I come to offer a chance to reave with honor on men who think the sea is a puddle. Asha lounged by the window with her boot heel grinding a nutshell into the pitted stone. She smiled like a cat with a fishbone. Honor, she said, the word tasting mocking and tender at once. She pushed off the wall, sauntered close, and cuffed Theon's ear with a familiarity that was either love or contempt and likely both. Show us your honor, little brother. Bring us Winterfell's gate on a leash. Theon turned to Balon with his familiar fury rising as helpless and heady as the smell of storm. You cannot hold the north in winter with ships and fire, he said, hearing in his own voice the tone of men he had laughed at. They know the land. They built beacons. They have women who can feed men twice who built their bones on snow. Balon sneered and then laughed, a sound that sounded like steel dropped on stone and hitting a brittle spot. Listen to the Stark son, he said. He's learned to speak white. He tells me a wolf taught a fish to walk. He rose. The motion was old and sick and still dangerous. We take what we can hold. We hold what men will bleed to take from us. That is all. I will be king of salt and rock. You will be my proof. He jerked his jaw at Asha. He takes the stony shore. He proves he still knows where he came from. Later we talk of castles. If he fails, he drowns with a blessing. A good end for a boy who prayed to trees. Asha's smile didn't change. She flicked a glance at Theon that said things other men would need sentences for and still confuse. Come, little brother, she said softly. Let's see if you remember the smell of oars. He did something that was not in the plan he had made to survive this visit. He waited until midnight when the longhouse slept like a beast drugged by the tide, and a man who had once shared his worst jokes with him dozed by a brazier. He wrote in a hand he had made rough and ugly the better to pass a rough man's eyes. Your coasts will be raided within a fortnight by longships masked as traders. Bear Island first. Deepwood when the smoke goes down. Theon Greyjoy sends this. If you trust me, I am less stupid than I look. If you do not, then forget this in the fire. He tied it to a raven with fingers that shook because he did not know if they made a bridge or a noose. He watched the bird vanish into a night that tasted of salt bishops and old gods. He whispered nothing out loud. Asha watched him from the doorway and let him think she had not. At Winterfell, Manderley's clerk woke Jon with a fist on the door before dawn could think itself born. The raven perched on the man's sleeve stared at Jon with a flat yellow eye like a coin that only buys rumor. Jon took the note and read it and closed his eyes. So, he said. He handed it to Margaery. He chose to be a son in at least this. Margaery's mouth did not smile, but her eyes did, briefly. Then we answer him like he is one, she said. We set traps in the shallows and we light wrong beacons on purpose and we leave the right ones unlit. We write to Meege before her morning and she will laugh and then she will wake her girls with her boot. She tapped the paper. We'll feed the Iron Islands with iron. We'll let them think their teeth do the eating. The morning ran. Messengers went with packs that did not jingle and faces that did not tell stories. At Bear Island, a grizz. Zled woman with a wolf sewn to her breast and a bear painted on her shield read the note Theon had sent and spat into the wind and tightened her belts and grinned so wide her daughters glowed with it. She smeared blue on their cheeks in lines that made them look like the daughters of the sea and of mountains both. Let them come, she said. We've old stories we've been saving for such as this. In the Riverlands, Robb squared his maps with his temper and set guards where wrong maps would send wrong men. He sent a rider to the phrase who crumpled one letter and sent another with a smile, and the second letter said what the first had not dared. If you take coin to let lions cross your bridge, the bridge will not remain all one piece. He signed his name with his father's shape in the letters and the ink did not blot. At the wall, Gior's men looked at the glass arrowheads as men look upon something they have made into a superstition and now must make into a tool. Sam soothed the birds and soothed the boys and soothed himself with lists. Corran Halfhand, whose signature could cut clean as steel, sent a scrap of leather back with 3 words burned into it with a coal. We go now. Margaery read that at breakfast, her spoon clinking the bowl twice after she had set it down. Sansa watched the little flinch and reached across the table to touch 2 fingers to Margaery's wrist. "Bring them back," she said, though no one at the table thought either of them could carry men out of the snow like babies out of bathwater. Margaery nodded anyway. "Yes," she said, "we will." They rode for Harrenhal and rode back and rode again, because politics is not a straight line and neither is war. The parley's ink had barely dried before a Lannister rider blundered into one of the coalition's wrong beacons and thought himself clever for avoiding it, and rode into a ditch with stakes at the bottom, and kept going because a stake had missed anything that mattered, and later died in his blankets of a fever that men will tell you is a gentle death and which is not. Baelish's letter arrived lined with flattery so precise even Lady Olenna set it aside to admire the stitching before plucking it apart. Tyrion's came with a smear of something that might have been wine or might have been blood and said, "Your queen has more bees in her bonnet than my brother has in his small clothes. If you hear humming, run." Jon scratched back. "If I hear humming, I will walk. Running brings wasps." He sent it with a raven that bit his finger as if to remind him of vows. On the road back north from the parley, the company camped beneath a stand of poplars that hissed their winter talk. Ned took first watch in stubbornness that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with the story he told himself about what fathers owed. Jon came to relieve him and found him awake and still and not cold at all. The two stood shoulder to shoulder. "When you were a boy," Ned said softly, "you wanted to run fast enough to arrive ahead of your own shadow." He looked to where Ghost lay like a spill of milk with 2 coals set in it. "I see you have learned the trick of letting your shadow arrive first." "I run slower," Jon said. "I do not run less." They stood without speaking and counted their breaths, and the branch clicks, and far in the night a cry that could have been a fox and could have been a story you told a child until he quieted. When the watch changed, Ned gripped Jon's forearm and then let go. Both men pretended that grasp had not been a thing they had both starved for. The Ironborn came like song says they do. At dusk and at wrong angles, sails furled until a gust hid them, oars muffled. Bare Island's shore lit with fires that made shadows leap like men. Women in green-threaded cloaks stood thigh-deep in surf with spears braced, and when the first longship's keel scraped bar, a girl of 14 who had learned to set snares with one hand while milking with the other put her spear into the soft place under a man's ribcage and screamed the joy of it. And when water took him, it took his name, and it did not much matter. The second boat tried to beach on a curve that looked gentle and was not. Meej had set stones there in a pattern her grandmother had taught her, and the boat's belly opened on them like a fish on a rock. They came again because pride does not learn quickly where water rules. The third wave met a line of archers with glass tips on their arrows that did not look like much in daylight but made men go down very quietly in the night. The tide carried a message back to Pike. "The shore bites." Word of the rebuff reached Theon at a table where Asha ate bread from both sides, as if manners were what men invented to prevent women from finishing their meals. She lifted a brow at him and he lifted one back, and when they laughed, it sounded like men learning to like the noise their own teeth made when they stopped chattering. Balon threw a cup at a wall. The cup broke. The wall did not. The old man glowered and asked who had warned wolves. Theon bowed deep. "A man who knows what it costs to lose a warm bed," he said. Asha clapped slowly twice, softly, as if she were applauding the merit of a jest that had almost succeeded in being more than that. In King's Landing, Cersei clenched her jaw until the pain sang in her bones like a harpist gone mad. She had felt the room tilt at Harrenhal and had hated it not because she lost anything in fact, but because the tilt had not been hers to command. She called for singers and for torturers and for Baelish and for Pycelle and sent them away again when none could slow the bees. She poured wine and added rose petals to it and drank and did not taste them. She dreamed of a girl with hair the color of Lannister glory standing beside a northern bastard with a wolf who watched her as if he could smell her thoughts. She woke with her hands clenched into her sheet. "Thorns," she said to herself, though no one listened. "We will pull them." Tyrion sat in his chamber with a half-burned candle and a clear ledger. He counted coin and men and bread and forces more intangible and yet heavier. He had the odd impulse to pray to someone other than himself and snorted at the notion. His prayer, when it came, was the note he wrote. "Keep your girl away from my sister's cups." He sealed it and did not write his name. He imagined Jon's mouth twist when he read it and smiled at the idea that a man raised on winter wind could learn to enjoy the savor of a thing that was both warning and joke. He stood and went to the window and looked at the city that stank of men and was nevertheless beautiful under dawn in the way farms are when the first furrow takes sunlight. He never imagined he would think wolves were the smell of hope. He shook his head. He blew out the candle. Somewhere a ship burned. Somewhere a baker needed. He told himself one was more important. The lie rested in him like a cat stretches and purrs. The road north bucked under the hooves. They crossed the green fork where ice had formed a lace that would take a boot for 2 breaths and then let go. They passed men with red noses and girls with red hands and little boy ghosts who did not know they were dead. They made Winterfell again with a weary that lived in their bones like a good bruise. Sansa ran to meet them and then walked because dignity has a rhythm and she meant to learn it to the end. In the hall, men thumped their cups and women nodded with their mouths tight because nodding at news about men who live or die is as dangerous as smiling at a lord. They had paper. They had ships. They had glass arrowheads curated like relics. They had beacons. They had a queen who wanted Margaery dead. They had a father held together by sons and duty. They had a sister moving like a knife in a house too big for 1 pair of feet. They had winter. They set their shoulders to it. One night, when the cold drained sound from the yard like a thief, Jon and Margaery took their cloaks and a lantern and went to the glass gardens. Inside the panes, the air was warm and wet. The apples had persisted longer than anyone could have dared to hope and hung like small suns. Herbs surviving on secrets breathed their sharp, bright into the night. Jon set the lantern down and fog pressed against the glass where his breath hit it. Margaery walked between beds where seedlings had learned to be patient. She touched a leaf and it sprang back. "This is the sound I wish I could teach the South," she said, and flicked the leaf again so it shivered and then steadied. Not a clamor, a hold. He thought of the wall and of Ghost reading wind and of Arya's hard mouth moving on a breath to write warnings onto air. He put his arms around her from behind and felt the line of her spine stop arguing with itself. He kissed her temple. "We make the hold," he said. "If anything grows after, it is a mercy." She turned and looked at him and did not speak because sometimes the only words left are the kind that will ruin a moment by existing. He took her hand. They stood in the green damp while outside the world scraped steel on stone. Somewhere in the castle, a raven shuffled on its perch and decided not to call. Somewhere at sea, a wave hit a rock as if persuading it to come along, and the rock declined. Somewhere beyond the wall, a man with half his fingers counted on the ones he had left. Somewhere in Harrenhal, a girl in a kitchen looked at the back of her hands and watched grease scum on dishwater catch the light and made a face and laughed and planned. When the summons came to send envoys to Gulltown to court the Vale, Jon sent a woman whose husband had died under a fry arrow and who did not cry anymore because tears had become too valuable to spend. She wore a new-made cloak with a green stitch inside it. When a boy stole 3 apples from the storehouses and was caught, Margaery said, "Give him 1 and teach him to carry wood until his arms feel like they've earned the second." When a man came from Deepwood with news that a Greyjoy ship had sunk off a point no one named because naming places you cannot fish at is bad luck, Jon sent a raven with a single line to Pike. "Your sea takes back what it gives." He did not sign it. He did not need to. They slept when they could. Sometimes they dreamed at the same time and woke at the same time and did not tell each other what they had seen because sometimes dreaming together is too heavy for a day to carry. Once, just once in those weeks, Margaery woke with tears on her face and did not wipe them. "Renly was laughing," she said. His laugh made wine look cheap. Jon set his hand on her hair, and the sound his own throat made was not a word and was honorable. Snow fell again. The beacons burned. The ravens flew. The letters came. The wolves howled. The roses held. The world spun with knives in it. They bent over their maps and their fires and their bowls and their seedlings and their children's quarters and their beds and their grudges and their duties and the stories they told themselves about what men and women can do when the night is long and the bread is not endless and the gods have other business. In the yard, Ghost lifted his head one midnight and howled a note so clean it seemed to wash the air. Men in blankets woke and lay still and smiled without knowing. In the kitchens, a woman baking bread paused with her hand in flour and wept once and then wiped her face with the back of that hand and went on. At the wall, a man whose palms had cracked so often they looked like maps blew into his gloves and watched the darkness and felt the heat of a fire like a friend's hand at the last possible moment. In the reach, a grandmother sharpened a thorn with her teeth and thought of her granddaughter at the top of the world and grinned. When morning came again, the work waited as it always does, with its stubborn, ordinary face. They went to it. They went together.